Well, I want to thank you all for being on this evening. I'm sorry that we had the link issue. That's the first time that's ever happened to me. I mean, I've done enough Zoom meetings, but oh, sorry. Okay. Got to make the speakers co-host, so we got that done. So, again, I want to thank you all for being on this evening. Sorry about the link issue. But like I said, that's the first time that's ever happened to me, and I've done enough Zoom meetings. I went to log on this evening and couldn't log on, and so we had to make a new link, and hopefully this will work just fine. I think there was some people who emailed me and let me know, and I sent the new link out to everybody. So I think we've got everybody on. Hopefully, and we might have a few people straggling in here, but tonight we're gonna finish up our regional hay school, our online regional hay school. We've got Jill Scheidt talking this evening about hay fertility and pest management. She's an agronomy specialist out of her office is actually in Barton County. She covers counties in the southwest part of the state. Then we'll have Wesley Tucker talk about economics of hay production and COVID considerations. And I sent you an email earlier this afternoon with a couple of links in it, or some information in it. The handouts from Jill. When Wesley's done tonight, I'll get his handouts and I will send those to you. We are recording tonight, so if miss anything, be recorded and we'll have that sent out. I'll get that sent out tomorrow. Also, there was an attached document tonight that was a satisfaction survey. It's Missouri Small Business Development Center satisfaction survey. The Missouri Small Business Development Ag Food and Forestry Center is sponsoring this event, and based on that, they would like to like for you to fill that out. They'd like feedback on this event, and so please fill that out and send that back to me electronically. Also, in the email, I sent you a link to a Qualtrics survey. That survey is for us as extension specialists, and basically that's an electronic survey. You fill that out, and the data comes back to me anonymously, electronically. You don't have to do any more, just fill it out and submit it. And so please try to fill out both of those surveys and get those back to us. We'd like to hear your thoughts on the hay school, and so with that, I will talk a little bit later about the Missouri Small Business Development Center for Ag Food and Forestry. They're sponsoring this event along with others, and we'll talk a little bit about that here after Jill's talk. And so with that, Jill, I think we'll let you have the floor. Again, if there's any questions or anything, just type those in the chat, and we'll answer those as we can this evening. So.
Thanks, Patrick. Can you guys hear me okay?
I believe we can.
Okay. All right. So tonight, Patrick asked me to talk about hay fertility management and pest management because they kind of go hand in hand, as you'll find out a little bit later here. So let me get figured out here how to advance my slides. So tonight, kind of what we're going to look at in fertility is just about kind of the major nutrients in our soils and how making hay affects those, and then some fertilizer sources that we might be using. So first thing I just want to show you is this chart. It kind of looks backward to me when I look at it, but basically what it's showing you on the left side is the minimum soil test level that you would need, or soil fertility level that you need to persist the crop that is on the far left. So if you're looking at alfalfa, we can see that we are going to need a minimum of medium soil fertility to sustain alfalfa. And for something like our cool and warm season grasses, they can still sustain on a little bit lower fertility. Now, do not take that to mean that your soils can be low fertility and you don't need to fertilize, or that you should, try for the minimum. Because if you're wanting to get yield and wanting to produce well, you need to be on the higher end or on the right side of, these bars if you're wanting to do a good job with hay production. So let's talk about some of the different nutrients first. So we'll start with phosphorus and potassium. And basically here with these, main thing is they're not prone to leaching a lot. So they do stay in the soil a little bit longer. That's advantageous because, maybe we can just do one fertilizer application of P and K a year. If we have more organic matter, it is going to stick a little bit more in the organic matter, and we can build that up over time. So let's take a look at what happens to our plants if we have low phosphorus in the soil. So basically, phosphorus is relating to crop growth, and it is essential for our legumes to survive and persist in our pastures or in our hay fields. So we have got to have phosphorus in order for our plants to grow, for them to have energy conversions, and to develop good roots. And with legumes in particular, phosphorus kind of helps the legume plant to fix the nitrogen. And then potassium, I kind of like to call potassium the Band-Aid, because it's going to help our plants to resist disease and to survive through the winter. It's also going to help it, like, repair anytime there's injury to the plant. So injury could include, an insect feeding. It could include mowing, could include grazing, any kind of injury to the plant. Potassium in the soil helps our plant to go ahead and recover from any injury that it has. So that's the importance of potassium in our forages. Nitrogen, it's a little bit different than phosphorus and potassium. Like I had said, they're not as prone to leaching, but nitrogen doesn't stay in the soil. Its forms change frequently depending on the conditions surrounding the time of application or soon after application. If we have a lot of soil moisture, it will kind of leave a little faster. If it's hotter, it could volatilize. It just kind of depends on the weather. So it is important with our nitrogen to try to apply it just right before the plant needs it, so that we don't take a chance at wasting any of that. Then we'll talk about pH a little bit. And pH, I think, is probably one of the most important things, the number one thing you need to get in line first off, because we have to have our pH at least above a 5, but we'd really like to see it in that 6 to 7 range, because it's going to help our plants to have root growth and to take up those nutrients. So let me show you a little bit what I'm talking about here with the nutrients. This is a plant nutrient availability chart, and basically on the bottom of that chart you can see the pH range from 4 to 10, and then the bars of the nutrients just shows their availability in comparison to what your pH is. So you can see kind of there from that 5.5 to 7, but really the 6 to 7 range in our pH, that all the nutrients that we really need for most of our crops, those major nutrients there at the top, those are fully available to our plant to take up whenever we have our pH in that 6 to 7 range. So it is really important to, know what your pH is, because if your pH isn't right, it doesn't matter how much fertilizer you put on, it may not be fully available to that plant to actually use if your pH isn't where it needs to be. So just some consequences of forgoing fertilizer and lime. And I didn't say this before, but our fertilizer, that nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, those need to be yearly applications. That's an application, a fertilizer application we make every year. Lime is as needed, or according to your soil test. So if we're not fertilizing and liming our fields when they need it, we're of course going to see yield loss. We're going to have a lot more weeds and possibly brush in our pastures, and of course reduced quality as well, just because we're not getting those vigorous plants growing. So let's talk a little bit about the difference in haying and the difference in grazing. And so haying takes out a lot more nutrients than grazing when we're comparing, what goes off of the field. So if we're looking here, we can see that we're going to if we put on some sort of fertilizer, whether that's manure, if we have legumes in there, or we're using a synthetic, after we, the grass uses those nutrients and we make hay, we're taking about 80% of those nutrients off the field and not putting them back on. Whereas if you think about cattle and grazing, their fertilizer's coming out the back end as they're eating. So there's putting some fertilizer back on, whereas hay, when you take it off, unless you're putting it back on that field, nothing's going back on. So here's just a nutrient removal comparison chart, just according to some different forages that we might grow. And as you can see here, some of our native warm season grasses are among the lowest nutrient removal whenever we're talking about how much they take off whenever we're producing hay. And fescue
Hey, Jill, can you hear me? Your audio has stopped.
Can you hear me now, Patrick?
You just came back on just now.
Okay, sorry, my phone sometimes doesn't get good service, so sorry about that. Okay, so if we look here, this is what nutrients are coming off of the ground whenever we take off that hay. So if we're not replenishing that, It's just continually coming off the ground, and our roots of our plants are having to keep searching deeper and deeper for nutrients, and there's just less available. So it is really important to put those nutrients that you take off of the field back on. So I will talk a little bit about soil testing here later, but basically with our soil test recommendations, we will tell you, you know, where your soil test levels kind of need to be and how much fertilizer you need to put on in order to achieve that buildup, along with enough fertilizer to accomplish the yield goal that you need. So I'll talk a little bit more about that here later. So I haven't updated this in a couple years. So these prices, I haven't even looked to see if they're anywhere close. Wesley knows that a lot better than I do. But basically, we're looking at, with these figures here, our fertilizer cost for cool season grass hay like fescue is going to add us up to about $47 per ton of hay harvested. That's how much we're spending in fertilizer per ton of hay harvested. So that probably kind of seems a little expensive. So what are some other ways that we can provide fertilizer that's not synthetic, so it's not coming, you know, so much out of our pockets directly? So some things that we need to think about with fertility, not only about fertilizer, but we also need to think about spraying for weeds and making sure that if we do have a high percentage of weeds in our hay fields or in our pastures, that we want to go ahead and take care of those weeds first by spraying for them before we fertilize. That way we're not fertilizing our weeds and really just wasting our money with our fertilizer. So, you know, it just kind of depends on your situation in your field and the percentage of weeds you have there, whether or not you need to spray instead of fertilize, or maybe if you have it in your budget to do both. And of course, another way to fertilize is, you know, let the cows do it for you. Let them walk around and be the manure spreader. So maybe that's taking into consideration, you know, letting those cattle graze that hay field, or if it's available to you, if it works out in your rotation, maybe allow the cattle, you know, to graze what you normally do as hay and kind of switch them back and forth. So don't always hay the same field every year. I know that's not possible for some and kind of the way your rotations work, but if it is, it's just a consideration to think about. And then some other things to think about, ways to get nutrients back onto the field, is thinking about maybe, you know, nutrient cycling with our hay and putting our hay back on and letting it put a little bit of nutrients back on the field. So there was a research experiment done taking hay, and I'll just go ahead and show you what it looks like. So basically they had a stationary ring that just stayed in one spot in the field. Then they had a ring that they moved every other day. And then they had another field that they just unrolled the bale of hay in a new spot every day, just to see kind of if we could better disperse our nutrients throughout the field. So there were cows in each field. They had collars on. Every time they put their head down, a green dot appears on the screen. So as you can see here in the top, where the bale stayed in one place, the cows congregated around the bale. They didn't move a lot, so you can bet that most of the nutrients are concentrated in that one spot in the field. If we look at where they moved the ring every other day with the hay bale in a different spot, you can see they still kind of stayed centralized around those rings, but we get a lot better distribution of where the cows are moving about. So, you know, the fertilizer that's coming out their back end is a little bit more evenly spread. And then we see with unrolling the hay, we get a really good distribution of the cattle across that paddock or moving across that field, and, you know, more evenly dispersing manure across that field. So again, here's just the aerial view of that. So just some different ways to think about, you know, putting fertilizer back on, or ways to, you know, spread fertilizer without actually buying it. Now, some things to think about, you know, unrolling hay sounded pretty good right back there when I talked about it, but just some things to think about. Again, another positive is, you know, those boss cows, there's a little bit more room for them, and the timid cows can still come up and eat. They are spreading out, you know, the hoof compaction and tracking up the pasture, you know, a little bit less in one area. It's more spread out over the whole field instead of having kind of a messy area where your hay is. And it does distribute the fertilizer, as you could kind of see if you're thinking about those little green dots across the field. But one thing to think about is make sure that you know what's in your hay, especially if you're buying hay, if you are unrolling, because if there's any weeds in your hay, when you were baling it, you're just spreading those weeds all across the pasture there. And a lot of times we'll get farmers that'll say, yeah, I had a strip, you know, of Johnson grass, or I have a strip of pigweeds just, you know, randomly show up in my pasture. Well, it's right where they fed their hay. So, you know, before you consider unrolling your hay, know what's in it too, just to think about you're not only spreading fertility or fertilizer across, or organic matter, you may be also spreading weeds. So just something to think about there. Okay, I don't know, I guess my slides got mixed up here. This should have went back with the lime, but we already talked about that, so I'm not really going to go over it. But I will talk a little bit more about lime and why it's important. So it is the most economical amendment to apply. And again, the reason why is because it changes our pH, it raises the pH, and if we can get our pH into that 6 to 7 range there, as you can see here in this chart, if we're at least at 6.5, our nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are fully available for the plant to uptake. So, you know, if we get our pH in the right area, that means the fertilizer that we put on, or the fertility that's already in our soil, is available for those plants to take up. Some things to think about if you get a soil test and it comes back, we don't want you putting on more than 2 or 3 tons of lime per acre per year. And the reason is it takes about 6 to 12 months for lime to break down. So if you just put a whole bunch on there, it's just going to take a really long time to break down. So you might as well just wait. And, you know, let's say you have to do 4 tons, put 2 on one year, and the next year put another 2 ton on, and just split it up so that it can kind of break down a little more evenly. And then as far as lime goes, they're not all the same. So a lot of times people get their soil test back and they say, well, this didn't tell me how many tons of lime to apply. And that's because each lime query has a different E&M guarantee. And E&M is the effective neutralizing material, and it basically is just kind of in easy terms telling you how finely ground the lime is. So the higher the E&M number, the more particles, so the more finely ground it is. And the smaller the E&M number, the bigger the particles and the less finely ground the lime is. And one is not better than the other. Usually around Southwest Missouri, I don't know where everybody's coming from tonight, but we have about 400, 450 is the normal E&M guarantee. And there are a few queries we can find upwards in the 7. And typically it really doesn't matter. I just tell people the only time I'd really like to see them try to find that like 700 E&M guarantee lime is if they have a really low pH, you know, something you know, below 5, and they need a lot of lime, you know, or there's a big E&M suggestion for the application. that kind of helps it break down a little bit faster just because it's finer particles, but really one's not better than the other. And again, just kind of, I'm really big on lime, if you could not tell, since I keep putting that slide up there. Okay, and so another way to think about putting, fertility on the field, the first night we talked about how legumes can add quality to your forages, and they can also fix a little bit of nitrogen and provide that to the plants at a later date. So, legumes like our clovers and our lespedeza, those are good choices to help us add a little bit of nitrogen to the soil. If we do put legumes in there, we need to see it be about 20 to 30% of the plant population to provide enough nitrogen that, we don't really need to add a whole lot more. And this is just kind of, showing some different, how legumes can increase our tonnage as well, and how it compares with adding nitrogen. And just another example here. So something to think about, too, is just if we don't have 20 to 30% of the legume the population of the plants being legumes, we will need to add nitrogen because it doesn't, it's not sufficient enough for us to provide all the nitrogen that, that fescue needs. And be sure, if you are adding legumes to your field, that, when you plant them, make sure they're inoculated, or that you, put inoculant on them as well. It just helps them produce that bacteria and fix that nitrogen so that they can grow and thrive as well. We already went over. Okay, so again, just kind of going back to this slide of, the cost of our cost per ton of hay harvested, that $47 range, that's with synthetic fertilizer. So, if we could take out some of that nitrogen cost, we can essentially take away half the cost of that ton of hay if we can add our legumes and let them provide the nitrogen that our plants need. So here's just kind of another, math and situation that we could look at to see if, it really does pay to overseed legumes. So if we look here at the top, it's just telling us that basically if we put 60 pounds per acre of nitrogen on, that's going to cost us about $120 over the course of 3 years. If we put on 1.5 pounds of white clover per acre over the course of 3 years, that's going to be about $9. So, if you can make that legume make up about 20 to 30% of your pasture population, you can save quite a bit of money. Of course, if you are going to put those on, make sure your lime and your phosphorus is where it needs to be so that clover or those legumes can sustain. So another thing to think about is, okay, so lime fixed nitrogen, and that's good. So, and adding synthetic nitrogen is good. So can you do both? Well, legumes and nitrogen fertilizer don't mix really well. Basically, if you add a lot of nitrogen to the soil, you're going to make those legume plants lazy. They're just going to decide, well, there's already nitrogen here. I don't need to fix it. I can get it whenever I want it. And they're kind of going to end up being spindly as well as you're going to encourage your grass to grow real quick, and it may shade out some of those legumes. So just do consider, whatever you're putting on. If you do have legumes in your pasture and you want to keep them, make sure that you're not putting a whole lot of nitrogen on, because if we basically put over about 75 pounds of nitrogen per acre and we have legumes, it's going to greatly reduce our legume population. So here's again just another iteration of that, kind of showing our percent lespedeza, our legumes in the field, and how as we add more nitrogen, as we go to the right of that chart, or the right of that graph, we can see that there's less and less legumes in our pasture as we add more and more nitrogen. So let's talk a little bit about, other sources of nitrogen. Of course, there's different forms of ammonium nitrate and sulfate and urea. Those are all good products, if we want to use those as well. And if we are going to use a synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, we do need to put it on at the right time. So the way I like to explain this is, as I said earlier, nitrogen is pretty mobile in the soil. It doesn't just sit there and wait for the plant to use it, kind of like phosphorus and potassium will kind of sit there a little bit longer. Nitrogen doesn't do that. So it's important, if you want the plant to use that nitrogen that you just spent money on most efficiently, you need to apply it right before the crop's getting ready to ramp up its growth, because that's when it's going to most efficiently use that nitrogen. And the way I like to talk about it is, when I was in high school and I played sports, my mom would always tell me before a game, make sure that you go get something to eat so you have energy to play in the game. And so that's kind of what we're doing here. We are giving those crops the energy they need right before they're getting ready to play the big game, or they're getting ready to really ramp up their growth. So for cool season grasses, of course, the growth curve there is in the brighter orange color, and you can see here in, right about now, here in April, that grass is really ramping up. Our fescue is really ramping up its growth. So they're about, March is when we want to target putting on our spring application of nitrogen. If we want to give our cool seasons another shot of nitrogen and make it be used even more efficiently, there late August, we could put another shot of nitrogen on. So it kind of helps with that fall growth curve as well. Our warm season grasses, sometime around June is a good time to apply. And if we have some winter annuals, just applying those there around that October time frame is a good time to go ahead and put the nitrogen on to help them right before they're getting ready to ramp up their growth. So it is important to know, what forage you have, when's its biggest growth curve, or when's it getting ready to ramp up its growth, so you can apply that nitrogen at the right time. So another source of nitrogen is animal manure. It's great if you need a complete fertilizer and if you've got them close to you, because if the trucking doesn't cost too much, then it's a pretty economical fertilizer to apply. Some things to think about is the nutrient levels may vary, even just from load to load, or even sometimes within a load. It depends on, what feed stuff and bedding stuff have been in with that poultry, can change the nutrient levels, as well as just, different, heat, and if there's any dead animals in there as well, composting, the nutrients change. It varies greatly. So it is important, if you are putting on any kind of manure, you get it tested so you know what you're putting on. And also consider that with the nitrogen portion of that litter, you're going to only be able to use about 25% of it in that first year, because about 50% could be lost to volatilization, then 25% is not available until the next year. So that is something to consider as well, that the the nitrogen is not quite as high as what it may look. And so here's just some, just a look at poultry litter or broiler litter, I'm sorry, put on some different fields and the, you know, our yield from that. So, you know, we can see you do kind of have to put on quite a bit of litter in order to get those higher yield goals. So just some things to think about, but it's still a good source of a fertilizer if it's something economical for you to obtain. And then here's what I'm talking about, where that litter can vary greatly in its makeup, because you can see here that there's a very, very wide range depending on what kind of litter it is. And even within the same types of litter, you know, there's a lot of a very wide range of nutrient availability there. So just be aware, always test it, always know what you're putting on. That way, if you do need to add a little bit of synthetic fertilizer, you're at least, you know, ready to do that. Okay, I already talked about this, just thinking about, you know, that your nitrogen, some of it will be lost and the other part won't be available. So just basically only figure in that about 25% of that nitrogen is available to you that first year. So this, I'm just little how you figure, if you've got some litter, how to figure up what's going on here. And so these are the conversion rates. These are the little conversion numbers that you'll need to use for phosphorus and potassium. If you're having litter and you're trying to figure out how much fertilizer you have. So basically we're taking, again, we're going to talk about with the nitrogen, if we had 50 pounds of nitrogen in our litter component, that basically we're only going to get to use, you know, let's say 40% is lost already. So there's only 30 pounds of that available. Through the conversion rate with the phosphate, we get about 87 pounds. And with potash, we get about 49 pounds. So if we kind of add that up and look at cost for that, you know, it costs about $80 a ton to apply. So it just depends, you know, it depends on what you need and if that provides enough nitrogen for you or not. So just make sure whenever you're buying litter, do your math, get your test done, fertilizer analysis done, so you know what you're applying and making sure you're really putting on everything that you want. So let's talk about soil tests here real quick. I think soil tests are really important. It's the first thing you need to do when you're thinking about fertility. That way you know where you are currently and how to get where you need to go in order to get the yield that you're looking for. So a lot of people will just call me and ask me how much, you know, fertilizer they need to apply, and I'll always tell them I really don't know. It depends on what your soil test says, because, you know, we just can't put down phosphorus and potassium at just some general rate, because we may already have enough in our soil, or we may have a really low soil test fertility level in those areas, and so we may need to actually add more. So it is always good to get your soil test done. They're really inexpensive. They cost anywhere from like $25 to $40, depending on what county you're in, to get a soil test done. So, you know, it's a good investment to make in order to put on the fertilizer that you need. We need to sample our fields about every 3 to 4 years. And it is important to take a good sample, because in a 20-acre field, there's about 40 million pounds of soil. And what you send to the soil, what you send to the lab is about 1 pound. So it is really important to get a good sample so that you are accurately get a good representation of what your field is. So when we're taking our soil tests, we need to go about 6 to 8 inches deep uniformly throughout the field. So that doesn't mean an average. We're talking uniform depth. Every time you stick a soil probe in, you want to go 6 to 8 inches. Don't go 12 here and 6 here and call it 8 inches deep, average across the field, because nutrients vary with different depths of the soil as well. You want to take about 10 to 20 cores. So stick that soil probe into the ground about 10 to 20 times. Put that soil in a bucket, mix it up really well, move any debris, grass, rocks, sticks. The lab doesn't test nutrient components of those, so you might as well not put them in there. Put it in a Ziploc bag. I like to tell people, if you get a sandwich bag and you fill it as full as you can possibly get, where you almost can't close it, that's about how much soil you need to send to the lab. And then, of course, label it whatever you call your field, just so you know later on when the results come back what that is referring to. There's some different tools we can use. You can use a lot of different stuff. I like soil probes the best. If you have rocky ground, some people like those augers with the more spiral end on them. You can use a shovel or a spade. I wouldn't do that. I don't think it's as accurate, and it's definitely a lot harder. But if you do, stick your shovel in the ground, pull it out, and then cut off. Basically, you're just going to want to cut off all the outside piece and only keep about an inch width of soil that's touching the shovel, because most of what's on the outer edge of that soil that's been collected is going to be a lot of topsoil, so it's going to skew your results and may not really be a good representation of your field. So just remember that if you are using a shovel. But most of our extension offices and even most USDA offices have a soil probe that you can use. Don't sample too soon after you put on an amendment to your soil, whether that's fertilizer or manure or lime. Try to stay away from any areas that livestock may congregate, so under shade trees, around ponds, feeding areas. Stay away from gravel roads. If you have, if it's particularly dusty, that could, kind of skew your results as to a higher pH. And depending on your lay of the land, depends on how many samples you need to take. So let's say this is one field and it used to have an old fence line running through it. And let's say the top half used to be hayed and the bottom half was normally grazed. Well, in that area that was hayed, again, like I said, haying takes off a lot more nutrients than grazing. So that may be a lower fertility area than what has that hillside on it. And also any dips, valleys, hills, different lay of the land there, you need to take a different sample, as well as our soil fertility can change with different landscapes as well. And here's just to iterate that. This is an 80-acre field, and you can kind of see, just based on different management practices, how the pH changes throughout the field. And you can even see there at the bottom, how it's a lot brighter red. That's where the dirt road is. And so our pH is higher there because it is kind of getting constantly limed. So, and again, just showing you this with some phosphorus examples as well, how that can change with different management style and even just the landscaping as well. So this is a look at our soil tests, and this is what they look like when they come back to you. I'm not going to explain this real in depth, just because I'm starting to probably get close to cutting into Wesley's time here, but basically at the top of the test, those stars, that tells you where your soil currently is. At the bottom, it tells you how much, where it says nutrient requirements, how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium you need to apply in order to get that yield goal that you want of 5 tons per acre or 200 grazing days. Over here is the limestone suggestion. This is where I'm talking about earlier, people saying, you didn't tell me how many tons of lime to apply. So if we look right here, basically we have 1380 as the E&M suggestion. And so if we called our query up and they had an E&M guarantee of 400, we would take that 1380 and divide it by 400, and we would come up with about a little over 3 tons of lime to apply. So that's kind of how you do the math there to figure up how much lime you need. So if we had a 700 E&M guarantee, then we'd take that and we'd see we'd have a little less than 2 tons of lime per acre. So you can see where it's important to know what your E&M guarantee is of the lime query that you're using, so that you apply the right amount of lime onto your field. That is all I had for that one. Patrick, are there any other questions while I pull up the next one?
Yeah, we've got a question here. How do you add calcium and magnesium?
That's a great question. So calcium, typically most of our soils, you know, a little bit of calcium will be added with lime, but typically in Missouri, we don't really have a problem with calcium needing to be added. As far as magnesium goes, if you're low on that, putting in dolomitic lime, I'm glad you asked that question because I forgot to talk about it, but dolomitic lime has magnesium in it, and it's the most economical way to add that to our soils.
Jill, was wondering, me and Wesley were talking. Is it all right if Wesley goes before your next talk?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
That's fine. Stop my share.
Kind of break it up a little bit, if that works.
Yeah, that's fine.
So, I think that why don't we give about 5 minutes or so? Let people stretch their legs if they need to, and then we'll. Oh, here's another question in the chat. Also, you said on my soil test, 90 pounds of nitrogen. Is that 90 pounds now or 45 now and 45 in the spring?
So I would
Or
like
fall.
to,
Yeah, basically.
sure. So I would like, if your soil test recommends you put on 90 pounds of nitrogen, I would like to see you probably do 2/3 in the spring and 1/3 in the fall if you want to do your split application. So 60 pounds in the spring, 30 pounds in the fall, something like that, just because you could do half and half, but really since we have the major ramp up in growth there in the spring, we want to give it a little bit more nitrogen then. But if it's not economical for you to do 2 applications, do it all in the spring.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. So why don't we take about 5 minutes and then we'll have Wesley talk on economics of hay production and COVID-19 considerations. Yeah, I think we'll go ahead and start back up. Before Wesley talks, I just wanted to mention one thing. In the chat there, I put for everyone, I put the website for the Missouri SBDC for Agriculture, Food, and Forestry program. And this is a program that myself and Wesley also work with. It's a new part of MU Extension. It's actually a partnerships funded by Missouri SBDC through CARES dollars from U.S. Small Business Administration. And basically, it's associated with COVID-19 money that was the CARES dollars. And so it's a partnership, and MU Extension specialists are part of that. And basically what it is we work and we provide business counseling at no cost to agricultural businesses that might need that. And so if you have any interest in that, or if you have any interest in having more, have an extension specialist look more at the business aspect of your ag operation, this would be the area that would do that. And basically, you can go to that website that I put there in the chat and sign up for this, and then there'll be somebody that'll contact you and kind of go through some of that business counseling that is provided through this program at no cost. And so I just wanted to mention that as since they're part of the sponsorship for this program. And so with that, Wesley, if you're ready to go, I'll give you the floor.
Patrick, can you see my screen okay and hear me
Yes,
all right?
Ken.
Okay, so yeah, as Patrick said, we did want to mention that because they are one of the sponsors for this. They're what's making it to where it's free of charge. So that's a good thing. I just thought I would mention right quick, you have seen this picture on many of the title slides. And so originally when we were trying to come up with these names for this school, Tim called this school, instead of Hay Production Schools, he called it Hay That Pays. And I really liked that statement. I really liked what that conveyed. And I will just say real quickly, if your hay bales look like that picture that we've been showing you there, I have a good standing guess to say your hay probably doesn't pay, because the marketing department came up with the poorest quality hay looking in that picture to give us that you can imagine. Can you see those big old stalks of fescue stems and Johnson grass stems in there? That is a horrible picture, but that's what they gave us to work with. So as he said, my name's Wesley Tucker, field specialist in farm business management. I am from Southwest Missouri, a cattle producer as well here. One of the things I wanted to show just real quickly is if you come to my office, any of you that have been to my office, you will see this little tractor and baler from where I was on a tour of the Vermeer plant in Iowa one time and got this little baler. But I love setting that there for kids to play with and stuff. And you know what? I've always enjoyed baling hay. I love mowing hay. I love baling hay. I love the entire enterprise of doing it. It's a lot of fun. But I get the chance to talk to you guys about the economics of this. And these are just a few of the things we're going to run through on a rather quick basis. I didn't mean to kick Jill off from her second presentation, but I thought I would give her a break. I knew everyone would hang around for her weed talk at pest management there at the end. So I thought maybe we won't stick the economics at the end because you guys might jump ship on me. I can't see if anyone's smiling right now. That's the problem with doing these virtual classes. But one of the things to think about, the very first rule of business is if you are not competitive, don't try to compete. And so one of the very first things you have to decide is my hay production business competitive? Really, if you think about it, you have three business choices. You can raise your own hay and harvest it with your own equipment. You can raise hay, but have a custom harvester come harvest it, or you could purchase hay. And we'll talk a little bit about the benefits of each of these and stuff. But the reality is I'm not going to try to change anyone's mind, because I know very well that we all have what we think is the best plan for our farm. And truly, it probably is, because there are no two farms in Missouri that are exactly alike, or situations as far as what equipment you have and how much extra time you have and things like that. And it goes a lot to the different kind of quality of hay that you're trying to make as well. So if I was to talk about, for instance, raising hay and harvesting it with your own equipment, well, it's going to take the most time. You will be able to control the harvest time and quality, though. Whereas if I'm going to raise that hay and harvest it with a custom harvester, it doesn't take as much time. It doesn't take as much equipment, but I am totally dependent upon a custom harvester as far as when they are going to get there and the quality of the hay that I'm going to have whenever they end up. But I will tell you, one of the things we're going to talk about when we get to price is, unfortunately, if I am selling hay, I would love to tell you that extra high quality hay brings a lot more than poor quality hay. And it does depend on what kind of package you put it in. But often in Southwest Missouri, or wherever you are located at, a round bale of hay is sold as a round bale of hay. And unfortunately, quality doesn't matter a lot. So it kind of depends if I'm planning on selling the hay or if I'm going to use it myself. It really becomes an individual situation for each operation. If I think about the cost of what it cost you to produce hay when we were doing these face to face, the first thing I would do is open up a blank flip chart and I'd ask you guys to tell me what it cost. And we would build a budget. We would put in a little bit of land cost. We would put in some fertilizer costs. We'd put in a little bit of equipment and we would come up with a budget. I love doing that to let you guys tell me what it actually cost. It's quite interesting. I've done that with lots and lots of audiences across Southern Missouri. And, I rarely ever get that number once people tell me below about $35 a bale seems to be about the bottom. Usually it's closer to 40, but sometimes I'll get it as low as 35. But it's kind of interesting. It actually comes out quite close to what the price of hay normally brings. If you think about what it's going to cost you to do, do this, you're going to have some fixed cost, right? You're going to have some machinery and equipment that you're going to have to own if you're going to bale it yourself. And so we economists talk about the dirty five, which is depreciation, interest, repairs, taxes, and insurance. Now be very careful if you go on the internet and want to Google dirty five. I'm not going to attest to what you may find, but that's what economists use to evaluate the cost of any piece of equipment is the dirty five. Your variable costs, those are going to be things that are not tied up as a fixed cost, but those are going to be things like your seed, fertilizer, supplies, my labor, even my repairs and maintenance. Those are things that if I don't use the equipment, it doesn't require repair and maintenance. But things like interest, those are all kinds of variable cost. Now, what does it truly cost you to mow, rake, and bale a field of hay? Well, you're going to have both. You're going to have those variable costs and those fixed costs. But one of the things that we have to think about is those fixed costs will vary depending on how much I use that piece of equipment, right? So more acres or hours that I use something, makes that ownership cost go down over time. That very bottom bullet point there, you can reduce the fixed cost of a piece of equipment by sharing it with a neighbor. And it's interesting if we were in the room and could talk about the pros and minuses of that. I've had people try that. It very seldom works out very well, often on hay and equipment. And why is that? It's because we all want it at the same time. Now, one piece of equipment that I do think that actually works pretty well on is wrapping equipment for baleage that Tim talked about, because if we have wrapping equipment, it widens the window of when we need to make hay so much that it allows us a little bit more freedom, and we only use it for a shorter amount of time as well. But we can get a lot of cost wrapped up in hay and equipment, can't we? $36,000 for a brand new mower and conditioner, $70,000 for a brand new baler with lots of bells and whistles. We can get a lot of cost wrapped up in these. Now, if you think about it, if I compare, and I know there's some lag time in when I move these slides, so I got to be careful when I start going back and forth. But if I compare the cost of owning that equipment, okay, compared to what a custom harvester might charge me, this is the custom harvesting rates that we do the survey. The University of Missouri Extension does a survey every few years, and at that time, the mowing was about $11.30 an acre. Raking was about $6.65. If we asked someone mow, rake, and bale, the average was about $21.48 if they were using net wrap. Well, let's just compare those. Let's set the cost of owning that equipment compared to the custom harvesting. And it kind of goes back to that age-old recommendation is you have to spread that equipment over about 200 acres to get the cost of using that equipment on my own operation down to what that custom harvesting rate through our custom rate survey has been. So, I could hire a custom surveyor at $21 a bale for about $90. Well, at 150 acres, I'm still at $103. So I got to get over that 150 acres and really close to that 200 acres, spreading that equipment over to get down below that. Now, again, that doesn't mean that I'm not telling you can't own your own equipment, but I'm just wanting you to stop and think about how much am I using that? Am I spreading it over enough acres or enough bales to make it worth it? One of the things that I think is interesting is we typically, when a custom harvester comes to my field, he charges me per bale. Or when we calculate our cost, we calculate our cost per bale. And I actually think that's a really bad mistake. I don't think we should be talking about per bale. I think we should be talking about per acre. For instance, several years ago, I called a custom harvester to come harvest some hay on my farm. And he said, yeah, he said, no problem. He said, I'll get there as soon as I can. He said, I charge $17 a bale to mow, rake, and bale at that time. But he said, I got to tell you, I got a big job to do prior to I can get to you. He said, so it's going to take me a little while. He said, I've got 125 acres for the neighbor to bale. So he went to the neighbors and he baled 125 acres and he got 300 bales. He finally got around to getting to my farm, who I only had 85 acres, but my farm made 398 bales. And so my question is, he charged us both $17 a bale. Which did he actually make more money on? All right. Well, you can kind of see which one that he had to cover less acres on, but got a lot more bales. And so if I pulled up, I just a few hours ago, I just quickly grabbed our forage budget generator and I just pulled up the fescue clover hay budget for this year. And if I look at one pass with a disc mower conditioner, one pass with a wheel rake, one pass with a round baler, baling up to a 1,500-pound bale with a nice sized tractor pulling it. If I take off that $5.52 that we charge for the pickup truck throughout the year, maintaining your acreage, that drops that to about $40 an acre. I've been with Extension in just a little over a month, actually less than a month now. I guess it's about 3 weeks now. I will celebrate my 20th year with University of Missouri Extension. And you know, it's interesting as I go through these, we go up and down, and sometimes it's more expensive based on fuel, and sometimes equipment's a little bit more or a little bit less. But we usually run somewhere between about $40 and $45 an acre that it cost us to mow, rake, and bale if we don't have to add something like a tedder in there. And so it's interesting to me, if it's costing me $40 to $45 per acre to harvest a field of hay, then if I'm only getting 2 bales to the acre, you bet $20 a bale is not outlandish to think about for a custom harvester. But if I'm asking that custom harvester or even using my own equipment and I'm getting 4 bales to the acre, that's a totally different scenario because the cost really doesn't go up that much more whenever I increase my yield. And so I go back to that original discussion that we talked about, hay that pays. Hay that pays is not what we typically do in a lot of our fields where we just run over a lot of acres getting a bale and a half to the acre. That is not hay that pays. Hay that pays is those of you that are sitting on this workshop that have came and said, I want to learn how to produce more hay and do it better, protect it from the pest, do a better job with my fertility so that I can produce a higher yield on the same acreage and use not only yield more, but also do a better job of lowering my cost of my equipment because I spread it out over more harvested yield. The other thing I wanted to point out from this real quick, you know, I was talking about that $40 to $45. Look, the operating cost is a little under $24. The ownership cost is $21.50, and that includes my labor. If I take that labor out that most of us don't account for, the ownership cost is actually over half of the harvesting cost of hay is in the ownership of that green paint. So again, am I utilizing it to its best ability and harvesting actual something that's going to produce good yield that's going to pay me back for it? Or am I counting my hay enterprise as an afterthought, all right, and running it over many, many more acres than I need and only getting a bale and a half to the acre? So, you know, I also want to acknowledge it depends on the kind of equipment you have. You know, Tim said the other night he'd already seen one of these self-propelled and fancy, expensive new balers out there. Or am I someone that can get by with something that's got a lot more age and rust on it? You know, realizing I'm going to have to do a lot more upkeep, and can I keep that older equipment going? You know, do I have the fanciest, newest mower conditioner? Or do I have one that's got a lot more age in it? Same thing with the rakes. Or did you have to use one of those old side delivery rakes like I still have sitting in my pasture? You know, realizing there's differences in equipment cost. And so if you are someone that can utilize some of this older equipment, you can lower your equipment cost down, but you're going to run yourself at more risk of breakdowns, and you're going to have a lot more labor involved with it. So it really becomes a trade-off. And sometimes the cost doesn't separate as much as you think it might from new to old, simply because with new equipment, we can spread over a lot more acres a lot faster sometimes. But I just want to acknowledge it does make a difference, the cost of the equipment that you're using. Realize with any kind of business, we want to make the best use of our capital. All right. So if we're investing in something, we want to make sure that it has a quick turnover ratio, that it will pay us back. Are we investing in something that's actually going to return us money? And realize that equipment, unfortunately, rust, rots, and depreciates. So we've got to be, once again, managing our acreage if we're going to make that equipment pay. There are a lot of opportunity costs that I will show you in our budgets that you will not include. Many of you will not charge a land cost, although realize if you're not baling hay on that, you could be doing something with that land. Most of you will not charge for your labor. Again, you know, I said I had that baler sitting on my desk because I used to really love and enjoy baling hay, but maybe I considered that my therapy, right? Another guy wants a bass boat. Maybe I wanted a nicer tractor and baler than everyone else. But you know, most of you aren't going to charge interest. So those are 3 things that most economists will talk about that you probably won't include in your budget. But there is one opportunity cost I think I'm going to make you talk about, is realize that if you are going to invest in tractors and equipment, then you have to invest in a few less cows. So one of the trade-offs of or opportunity costs you have to take into account is if I'm going to harvest my own hay on my own land, then I'm going to have to run 15%, maybe as many as 20% less cows than if I chose to just say I'm going to buy my hay instead. So you're going to have to do some cost comparison there and say, you know, if my hay is costing me $35 a bale to bale it, and I could buy it for 40, would I make more money if I could run 20% more cows? Sometimes running more is not always better. Again, that decision is going to have to come down to each situation. But let's think about real quickly, you know, Jill just talked a lot about the nutrient removal distribution. If you are selling hay off your farm, you do have to account for those costs. Absolutely, no doubt. Because that selling that hay, once that nutrients leave your farm, there is a lot of fertilizer wrapped up inside that bale. Now, if you're utilizing the hay back on your farm, you're feeding it back on your farm, then we have to start talking about nutrient distribution. You know, and is it being spread back out as evenly as it was rolled up? Jill said that I would probably have some newer numbers. I've actually kept some older numbers in here because they're a lot lower. Your fertilizer numbers would be a lot higher than this right now. But even at those low numbers, you know, every ton of fescue hay you takes off about $30. So again, that's $15 for a 1,000-pound round bale. And again, those are some old fertilizer numbers. It would be considerably higher than that now. But you do have to think about, if I'm feeding it back on my farm, is the nutrient credit that I'm claiming, you know, that I'm feeding it back, is it actually being distributed evenly? Or if I'm buying hay and I'm trying to claim that nutrient credit, is it actually being distributed evenly? And, you know, when Patrick talked the other night about feeding hay, and Jill just showed that one slide about the different studies of the different way they will do it, I'll argue we don't get a lot of the advantage of our nutrient credits often whenever we feed hay like this. We do a good job maybe of utilizing the hay, but the nutrient credit is not being given us the full advantage of it. Same thing even with unrolling. Although unrolling is better, we are still spreading a lot of those fertilizer drops that coming out of the south end of that cow in a line up and down that field. And so if you think about it, we talk about it in the grazing systems, you know, what would you do if when you hired the fertilizer guy to come out and spread your fertilizer, instead of driving the big spread truck over the 40 acres, instead he just went to one spot in the field and he just went round and around and around and around in little circles? Would you ever invite him back, or would you feel like you needed to pay the fertilizer bill? Well, you wouldn't, because he didn't do a good job of spreading the nutrients back out. And I'll argue a lot of times we don't do a very good job of taking advantage of the nutrient credits that we have in our hay. Tim talked the other night about, I think it was Tim at least, talked about hay storage and you know, the advantages of that. I just want to show this chart to show you that as your hay gets more valuable, gets more priced higher per ton, those percentage losses become even bigger. If you think about that, a 20% loss of $100 a ton hay is a lot bigger loss than 20% loss of $40 a ton hay. Well, once again, as we do a better job of doing things like this school and learning how to do a better job of producing higher quality hay, then we really too have to step up our game on the storage as well. We can't afford to do the things that these folks have been talking about and just wasting the hay through storage, okay? The other cost that most people don't account for, and especially those that buy hay, is, well, we say, well, I bought hay for $35 a bale, but we don't account for the cost that it took me to get it home. And if I hire someone to run a truck over the open road, they're going to charge me about $4 a loaded mile. Well, when I'm running that gooseneck up and down the road, is it costing me that? Well, it might be interesting if you stopped and calculated your fuel. I know whenever I haul hay, what it costs me in the fuel, and it doesn't cost me $4 a mile. But you know what? Once again, I'm not accounting for my time, my labor. I'm not accounting for the wear and tear on my pickup truck. And so I think we have to also think about what it's costing us to move hay from farm to farm or when we buy it. And I think it costs us more than we think it does. Want to real quickly mention, if you have not used our forage budget generator tool, please do. Just go to the extension 2.missouri.edu website and type in forage budgets, and it will pull up. We have all the different forage budgets out there for alfalfa establishment, alfalfa square bales, alfalfa round bales, fescue hay clover. We have fescue seed production followed by hay. We have all the different budgets that are out there that you can download in PDF form, just like this to my right, or you can actually download an Excel spreadsheet that's called a forage budget generator. Go in and tweak it and change the numbers just a little bit. Most of the cells are protected, but you can change your yield, you can change your prices, your fertilizer prices, you can change what size of tractor you use, all these different things to come up with what your costs are. It's a really neat little tool that you can adapt for your operation. If you've not used it, I would encourage you to check it out. Tim mentioned the other night about baleage, and I want to just highlight this real quick. I got asked to go to a cattleman's meeting not a few years ago, and they asked me, they said, tell me how many acres I have to run over to, or how many bales I have to put through it to justify a wrapper. And so, again, the economists, as I said, we talk about that dirty five, that depreciation, interest, repairs and maintenance, taxes and insurance. And so I just pulled up and I said, all right, well, let's say I got to buy a $35,000 inline wrapper. And one of the kickers is, how much more does it cost? Tim mentioned a baler that will allow me to bale high moisture hay. Well, they don't cost all that much difference. A high moisture baler is probably about a $3,000 add-on if you're buying a new baler. But one of the things that does matter, I think, in our decision is, will my current baler do it, or do I have to sell my baler and buy a new one to do it? That makes that decision a lot harder. But anyway, back to my original question. So I just took $38,000 and I put it at a 30% salvage value, threw it in about 7 years, and I come up with some depreciation. I come up with interest. I come up with some repairs and maintenance and taxes and insurance. So my dirty five is about $7,000 a year to run that $35,000 inline wrapper. So if I figure that over bales, well, that $7,000 over only 400 bales, by the time I add a little bit of labor and a little bit of plastic in there, I'm at almost $20. Now, if I go up to 800 bales, then that drops that down to about 10 to 11 bucks. If I get to 1,200 bales, then I'm down to about that $8, which $8 sounds like, I've not talked to anyone recently, but a lot of times that seems to be what people, custom wrappers have been charging out in the country. So it's interesting, just to look at those numbers, I'd say I'm going to have to run at least about 800 bales to get my cost down there somewhere in that $10 a bale range. The question you might ask, well, what does that acreage to run 800 bales? What does that really need to look like? How many acres is that? Well, for just to check it out, I took our last year's budget generator that I was just talking about, and I said, let's look at an alfalfa budget. And so I went in and I ran an alfalfa budget, and I looked at 80 acres of alfalfa with 5 cuttings, and I could get 5 tons of dry forage, or maybe I decide to wrap it all, 9 tons of baleage. That would be about the equivalent of about 960 bales. And when I do that, running that wrapper in there in our forage budget generator comes out to about that $7.50 per bale. So again, somewhere in that $8 to $10 a bale range. Now, what do you get for that? That's the real question: is can I justify an additional $8 to $10 per bale? Well, it really is going to depend on your operation. Tim talked about the advantages of the dry matter losses that it saved and the quality that it saved. But I also am going to ask what kind of class of livestock you're going to feed it to. If you're still going to wait until July 4th to go out and bale your hay, and you're going to bale junk hay and then go wrap it and think that it's going to turn it into something really, really good, you're going to be vastly disappointed. However, if I'm going to jump out there when I've got some quality forage and I just can't get it baled up as dry hay because I can't get a 3-day window that the rain's not going to come in early May, and I'm going to jump out there and bale it up when it's quality, if it allows me to improve my quality, then that $10 investment becomes really, really pretty inexpensive. So it really does depend on how you're going to continue to manage your forage and what kind of class of livestock you're going to feed it to. Often I will argue that when we do really, really make good quality hay, often we feed it to an animal that doesn't necessarily need rocket fuel sometimes. So if I'm a spring calver and I've got dry cows in the winter, they don't need rocket fuel baleage. But if I'm a fall calver and trying to have a cow that's nursing a calf through the winter, or I'm trying to background some stockers, rocket fuel can really pay itself back. So it does depend. It depends on each operation and every setup. Tim mentioned the other idea the other day about having a barn or having a rock pad to stack your bales on. I just threw together some economics on that real quick. You think about it, even if I figured that rock and that tarp is only going to last me about 3 years, well, that's only about $5,000 that I can store 120 tons of hay under. Now I'm going to argue that rock is going to last a lot longer, but even with a 3-year time period, what does that get me as far as storage cost? And what does that get me in hay savings? He talked about the stacking the round bales on end and how much, I could get in a barn. Well, again, if I look at that barn as a significant investment, now, unfortunately, with COVID and stuff, you can't get it at $9 per square foot anymore, I don't think. But, figuring at $9 a square foot with a 15 to 20 year lifespan, that's still, I can get a barn cost down there fairly reasonable looking at over time. What does that mean? What do I get as far as cause of that investment? How does the return for that? Well, again, it goes back to what I'm storing and what I'm keeping. This is a picture from 2018 when it was so hard to find hay. I stumbled across this producer that these bales are actually 3 to 4 years old. All right. And he baled some really, really good tight bales. But again, unfortunately, he stored them on a very flat spot that wasn't real well drained. So whenever I went to moving them, and these bales were by far not the worst. There were some bales that were complete half moons by the time I picked them up, but they were really good and solid up on top, but the bottoms of them were just gone. And again, as I said, I wish I'd have took a picture of some of the really bad ones. I had some that were literally half moons. By the time you picked it up, you had to be very careful, or the round part just fell out because there was no bottom part of the bale. So I go back again to that slide that I showed you earlier on the economics of hay loss. And, if I am going to take the things to heart that we've talked about these 3 nights, and I'm going to try to produce something better than combine fescue seed aftermath hay, then investing in something like a rock pad and a tarp or a barn suddenly starts paying itself back quicker because I've got a higher value forage there that I'm trying to protect and that I'm trying to keep protected in storage. You know, that is one of the things about baleage is you essentially get a free barn from it, don't you? So, you know, if it's costing me $10 a bale to stick that in baleage, I would argue a barn's going to cost me $5 a bale. So if I'm getting $5 a bale free storage from it, suddenly that wrapping doesn't cost as much as I had just told you it did either. It is interesting to think about hay prices, though. You know, if I pull up, this is the weekly hay market summary from, several months ago. But if you pull that up and you think about how we price our hay, unfortunately, it does make a difference whether you are utilizing the hay yourself or whether you are selling it, doesn't it? Because if I'm going to utilize the hay myself, I want to put in as big a package. I want to have as big a package bale as I can so that I've got less surface area. Do you actually realize that a 5x5.5 or a 5x6 bale has less surface area to gain rain and moisture and rot than a smaller bale does per volume? Okay, now, yes, admittedly, the bigger bale has got a bigger outside covering, but I have more hay in it. So there's more hay that's on the inside and protected. There's actually more surface area on a 4x5 bale exposed to the weather elements than there is on a larger size bale per volume. But the other thing to think about if I am going to sell my hay is the smaller the package, the more I get for it. All right. So it's interesting. Sometimes I use the comparison when we're doing alfalfa schools that I just say, well, let's look at the price per ton on alfalfa, whether it's in a large package or a small package. All right. So if I look at that time when I pulled up that hay market listing, alfalfa was running $160 to $200 a ton or $180 a ton. But if I put that same alfalfa in a square bale, a small square bale, it was running $5 to $9. So I'll say the average, the middle, $7 a bale. So $7 a bale divided by 55-pound bale is actually $254 a ton. So I made $254 a ton is what I sold it at in a square bale, or $180 a ton in a large round package. I lost $74 simply by putting it in a large round package, or 41%. So the package we put it in matter. And if I'm going to sell hay, to be honest with you, I make more by putting it in a smaller package. You really want to talk about value added. I pulled this off Craigslist one time. This was alfalfa hay being sold in an 8-ounce bag for $5.50. And so I quickly did the math and I said, well, $5.50 for an 8-ounce bag. That means that is either $660 for a 60-pound square bale or $22,000 a ton. It was what they were selling that alfalfa for. They didn't have to sell very many of those 8-ounce packages, did they? But anyway, again, it does make a difference whether you are selling the hay or utilizing it yourself as to the package that you're putting in. Also, the quality. As I said, I hate to admit it. But unfortunately, in our hay markets, we don't receive the premium that we deserve for better than average hay. It blows my mind all the time that people will pay $25 for a 600-pound bale of poor quality hay, but they will not pay $40 a bale for a 1,200-pound bale of premium quality. They just won't do it. It blows my mind. Patrick mentioned earlier the Small Business Development Center, and so he's already told you that. I was going to mention that as well, just to say that we are available for business counseling, not only on hay production, but a lot of other things. For instance, I've been working with several clients today, succession planning. helping people pass the farm to the next generation is something that I'm advising a lot of clients on these days. So, if you could use some business counseling on something, please reach out to us, because at least until the end of this year, the grant is covering the cost of all of those services. So I will turn it back to Patrick, and I will stay on during Jill's. If you think of any questions, just drop them in the chat, or if you have any questions now, feel free to holler.
Thanks, Wesley. I don't see any questions in the chat right now. Let's, I guess, Jill, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. Why don't we go ahead, and for time's sake, why don't we go ahead and if you're ready to start, or if we need a few minutes, that's fine too. We can take 5 minutes. Why don't we just go ahead and take 5 minutes and reset everything, and then we'll move on with your talk about pest management.
Okay.
Okay, Jill, if you're ready, I think we'll go ahead and start again.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
So the last segment I'll talk about is pest management in hay. And so tonight I'll mainly focus on herbaceous plants because we usually don't have to worry about brush in fields that are for hay only. And one of the main reasons for weedy areas, aside from weather extremes, is areas of thin stands. So it is important to assess the field and what factors could be causing, less competitive, desirable plants. So, a lot of times we have a lot of different grasses that people will call us about. And with a lot of these, it is important to remember or think about that if we just give our grass the competitive edge, we won't see many of these. They're just simply taking the opportunity to pop up where either our soil fertility is low in the instance of broom sedge, or just popping up in areas where we have thin stands. So we already talked about soil tests, why they're important. So again, I'm just going to reiterate really quickly. Make sure you take a soil test. That way you can have proper fertility in the field. And remember that whenever you are filling out a soil test with us, you can get up to 4 different cropping options, all for that same price. So you can kind of see, what does it cost to make 2-ton hay versus 4-ton hay versus grazing for 6 months. So, just make sure that you take advantage of that in your soil test and getting all the information that you can. So again, just an example of how proper fertility can make a difference. We just sometimes, most of our weeds can be controlled by simply improving the competitive edge of the desired species. So in this study here that you're seeing a picture of, a fescue field with broom sedge was treated with phosphorus while the other half was not. And as you can see, with the half with the increased fertility easily outcompeted the broom sedge. So a lot of times we get calls on this and people think it's lime that needs to be added, but typically it's usually phosphorus. So just keep that in mind. Again, fertility really does help to solve a lot of our weed problems just because we're making the desired grasses stronger. So, again, examples of cultural control are fertilizer and lime. So we can outcompete those annuals, those annual weeds that we have, or any low growing, broadleaf annuals as well. And that shading out does help to, not allow some of those weeds to germinate. So I will just note that our state weed specialist, Kevin Bradley, did a survey on 26 Missouri pastures, and he found that basically if we can just increase 1 unit of pH, we're going to have about 3,000 less weeds per acre. And if we can increase 0.1 unit of P and K, we can have about 380 respectively fewer weeds per acre in our field. So again, just another example of how fertility can help us take care of our weed problems. And then I already talked about feeding hay and considering what's in there and thinking about that as a source of spreading weed seed as well. Something else that on my farm in particular we think about is we have some of our pastures that have converted to a novel fescue and some that are still in Kentucky 31. So we have to label our hay and make sure we know where our hay is coming from, even if it's not, if we know it's not weedy, we have to make sure we're not putting Kentucky 31 hay on our novel endophyte pastures. That way we don't spread that Kentucky 31 back into that novel endophyte pasture that we spent a lot of time and money putting into place. So just some other things to think about as well. So first step in weed control is always correctly IDing the weed and knowing what you have, and knowing what stage of growth and the proper rate and sprayer settings you need in order to effectively control that weed. So the most effective chemical control is applied when the weed is actively growing, so it does take in the chemical. So some considerations there is don't brush hog before you apply a herbicide, because if we do that, basically we're injuring the plant, and it has a mechanism that tells it not to take in anything to protect itself while it kind of repairs. So if you brush hog and then you spray, you're not going to get very good absorption of that chemical into the plant. So, ID is very, very important, so we know the correct time to spray and the right type of spray to use if we are using chemical control at all. This is a great resource. I believe it's $35. Kevin Bradley, our state weed specialist, made it. It's Weed and Brush Control in Our Pastures. It's a really nice book. It's got color pictures and descriptions of the most common Missouri pasture weeds, and it's got instructions on kind of when the best time is to spray for it, or what the best control options are, as well as in the back of the book it has a table listing all the different herbicides that can be used as well and their efficacy ratings. So just wanted to point out that is a really great resource that when we have in-person classes, we typically have some on hand so people can purchase them. Something we hear a lot is people don't want to spray because they don't want to kill their clover. But if you have so many weeds in your pasture or hayfield, that clover is not doing a lot of good anyway, and it's really more cost effective to get rid of those weeds so you have more productive grass, and then reseed that clover if needed. So, just always consider that even if you have clover, those weeds really, really take away from the quality of your forage. And as far as Lespedeza goes, you normally 2,4-D, if we spray it earlier in the year, it's not going to affect our Lespedeza if we have that in our hayfields or pasture, because it doesn't come up until the summer. So, sometimes we can avoid hurting our legumes if we just spray at the right time. Now, I'm not going to go over all of the different options, spray options, because Patrick has sent you this, so you have it here to look at whenever you want. You can look at all the different options of sprays. So I'm just kind of going to quickly go over kind of timing as far as when you should spray for different weeds. So thistles are usually a big problem in a lot of our fields. They're biennial. A lot of these weeds here I'm going to show you first off are biennials, which means they have 2 years of growth. First year is vegetative, and it's in a rosette stage. Second year is reproductive stage. So that's when the flower comes out. The time whenever it's in the vegetative stage is the best time to spray. Once it's hit that reproductive stage, once like let's say a thistle has bolted and the flower comes up, it's going to be strong enough to produce viable seed whether or not you spray it. So the best time here is spring or fall to go ahead and control them when they're in the rosette stage. Don't wait until they get big and they start to flower out. You're not going to achieve effective control to get control of next year's thistle crop. So just keep that in mind with a lot of these. Same thing, poison hemlock, fall or spring, when it's in the rosette stage, before we get those flowers out, is the best time to spray for that as well. Spotted knapweed, I'm not sure if everybody has this, but it is something that we want to get rid of in the rosette stage as well, just because it's one of those prolific seed producers that can become a really big problem in our pastures and cattle do not like to eat that. So different chemical controls for that here, and we can actually also spray this in the late bud or rosette stage sometimes with some different chemicals. So just keep that in consideration as well. So always read the label, and it's going to tell you the best time to be spraying for some of these weeds. And again, remember with weeds, it may take 2 to 3 years before you achieve complete control, and especially with spotted knapweed, it is going to take a few years. So be patient with it. If you happen to have it in your fields, be patient and just know you're going to have a couple-year battle to try to get rid of it. And I already talked about that we should spray most of our biennial weeds, which were the ones I just showed you up there. We need to spray those when they're in the rosette stage. Buckhorn plantain, I get a lot of calls on this one as well. It's a cool season perennial, and it reproduces by both seeds and roots. And the problem here is it spreads out wide, so it just begins to take up a lot of space for the small, short plant that it is, and it reduces a lot of our tonnage. So that can be a big pest, weed pest in our pastures. So here's the different herbicides that you can use to spray on buckhorn plantain. Again, look here with 2,4-D, graze on P+D, read the label, because sometimes it will tell you to use with specific plants or weeds that you're trying to control. You may need to use the higher rate, even if you don't have a bunch in the field. So be sure to read that label. And there are some control in alfalfa, control options in alfalfa for buckhorn plantain as well. Maypop passion flower, this has been around, but I think I'm just starting to see a lot more of it. So it is pretty hard to control because it is a woody weed. So it is going to take some time to control just because of the vine that it has. So make sure that if you see that, you kind of gain control of that fast before it becomes a problem. Blackberry, a lot of people have problems with this. There's actually a few options for timing of spray. You can do it either when it's flowering or after it has flowered. And something important here to remember with blackberry and dewberry, again, do not brush hog it in the same year you want to control it, because we need that second year of growth. That's the growth year that normally takes in the herbicide and kind of helps us to get rid of blackberry. And again, just that injury as well to the plant. If you injure that plant, it's not going to take in a herbicide as well. And again, with blackberry and dewberry, that is going to be like a 3-year, battle for control of that. So it's not going to happen in the first year either. And just some, looking at this is just kind of how it can really invade our pastures, and we need to just try to take care of it, when we can, because, if you look there, that's a lot of thorny stuff going into our hay, and I can't imagine the cattle are very excited about biting into a bale and getting some of that in their mouth. So that turns into some pretty low quality hay. Common ragweed, this is another one that shows up in our fields. We need to get it when it's a little bit smaller as well. Kind of May time frame is when we're looking at spraying for it. Spiny pigweed, again, same thing. And horse nettle, again, same time of year, kind of that, late April, May time frame for a lot of these weeds here. Johnson grass, normally when we do this in person, we might ask people, to raise their hands and tell us, who likes Johnson grass and who hates it. Because one thing about Johnson grass is the good thing about it is it does have high quality. The bad thing is it can spread and overtake really fast. And then also when we get into a drought situation, we can have nitrate and prussic acid problems arise from it as well, especially in our hay fields with nitrate and Johnson grass. If we have a drought situation and you have high nitrate levels in your Johnson grass and you go ahead and dry bale that hay, the nitrate level gets preserved in the hay. It does not dissipate after baling. So just be aware of that. If you have Johnson grass in your hay fields and you've got a dry year, make sure you're testing it for nitrate before you put it up for hay, because that can become a dangerous situation where we're preserving that nitrate level. There's some different control options. Heavy grazing, obviously, we don't really like that because we don't want to destroy the good grass either, but we have some different options in our Bermuda grass as well. And then there's Outrider that is labeled for pasture but not labeled for hay. And then of course you can use glyphosate and just use a weed wiper and hit it. If you are going to use glyphosate, Kevin Bradley kind of found the best time to treat Johnson grass with Roundup is to do it kind of there in the early fall time frame, kind of September. Go over it with a weed wiper, because typically, although, you know, Roundup only kills what it touches, because Johnson grass is a perennial and because we're moving into fall, the Johnson grass will actually take some of that Roundup down into its system, and it can kind of help kill the roots too. So if you want to try Roundup, maybe try it kind of in the early fall there and see if that kind of helps control it a little bit better with just a slightly different timing. Winter annuals, I don't really see these to be a big problem in hay fields, but you need to spray them in the fall or early spring. Basically with our winter annuals, once the flower's out, it's too late to control it. With henbit, I'm down in Barton County where there's a lot of crop producers, and I'll have them call me pretty often wanting to know how to control their henbit, and they usually call me sometime in March and say, you know, that purple flower thing's out in my field, what do I do with it? And I said, well, it's too late now, because basically when the flower's out with a winter annual, it is either A, already dropped its seed, or B, produced viable seed. So even if you spray it with a herbicide, it's still going to produce viable seed that's going to come back next year. So you do have to control those winter annuals before you see that flower, before the reproductive stage happens, so we don't have seed laying on the ground for next year. Alfalfa weeds, there's some options, and if you don't already know it, I'm sure you do if you grow alfalfa, but they do now have Roundup Ready alfalfa. That's a great technology that's out there now that we can use to control a lot of weeds in our alfalfa, and that's been really helpful. So you know, if you're growing alfalfa, maybe consider using some new technologies, you know, the next time you're getting ready to revamp your stand there. As far as alfalfa goes, that can really provide, you know, a lot of control options to open up. And of course, the big disclaimer here with all of us is that we want you to make sure you read the label. It's the law, and it can, you know, just reading the label can help you answer your questions and figure out if the specific weed you're trying to control will be controlled with that chemical, and what the instructions are in order to get the best results or the best control of that weed. So make sure that you're reading that label. So let's talk a little bit about forage and pasture insects. I'm not going to go too much into alfalfa unless if you guys want to comment in the chat if you do have alfalfa. I can talk about these a little bit, but I'm going to mainly focus on our fescue here with the true army or the army worms. So Tim Stockenberg, who talked to you last week, he took this picture, or producer sent him this picture, and I can't remember if it was 3 or 4 years ago, but basically here, he had a farmer that texted him this picture. These armyworms were all over his mower, and he said, "What do I do?" You got to kind of be looking out for armyworms here. In a couple weeks, we should probably start scouting for them in our fescue fields, especially I always start, when I check fescue fields, I always start with the best looking ones first. That's where they're most likely to be. And I just check them weekly, or even I start to check them daily if we get close to threshold levels, because when they get to this point, the chemical is not going to kill them fast enough to save the crop. We just have to go ahead and hay it right away instead of trying to spray it. And just know, again, with insects, typically we only have 1% of our insects are destructive insects. 5 to 20% of them are beneficial. And then the rest, the large majority of them, are just there in the field, not causing a problem. They're not helping anything, but they're not hurting anything. So it is important to have proper ID of our insects, because such a few percentage of them actually cause a problem in our hay fields. So a little bit more about true and fall armyworms. They're going to feed on our grass crops, leaves, in particular in either the spring and summer, or summer and fall. The threshold level there on armyworms is when there are 4 or more per square foot, and you need to get rid of them before 2 to 3% of seed heads are cut if you are growing your fescue for seed. So that's just a spring recommendation only. And typically, as far as best time to spray those, you want them to be half grown, so a little bit over a 1/2 inch long. Whenever you spray them, that's going to provide the most effective control. Typically, if they're the itty bitty small armyworms, it's going to be hard for the spray to come into contact with them. If they're those bigger 1.5 to 2 inch armyworms, they're getting ready to end their life cycle. So, they're not actually feeding much and doing a lot of damage anymore, so that, the spray really isn't going to be economical at that point. But our family has a lot of fescue fields that we grow for seed, and so I usually check them on a every other day basis, kind of when we get to May, especially if we kind of have, humid, warm conditions. I really start checking them hard, and I start with those fields that look the nicest, just because that's the place where they're most likely to be. And if we get, close to 3, when I check in a couple spots in the field, I call my dad and tell him, it's time to spray. So, you really have to stay on top of these armyworms, because they really can destroy a field in one night. And I'm sure that you've heard stories, or maybe even seen it yourself. As far as identification goes with armyworms, they have 4 prolegs in the middle of their body here. You can see those 4 arrows pointing to those 4 legs. That's a way to tell an armyworm apart from many others. And as far as true armyworms go, they'll have that little black tip on the end of their legs. So you can also identify true armyworms by that. Also consider the conditions whenever you're spraying. A lot of times armyworms are a problem in wheat as well. And sometimes if we kind of get a warm, humid rain that's got some wind come through, it can bring in a pathogen that kills those armyworms. So if we have conditions like that, be looking for armyworms that have been mummified, like this black one here. Sometimes they might be white. They usually, crawl to the top of the plant and kind of rear up, like a horse. And then they just die, and then they mummify like that. And so if you see those, or if you look on the ground, maybe you've knocked some off and you see those on the ground, you know, maybe consider holding off on a spray depending on what stage in life those armyworms are, just because it may not be economical to spray because they may be getting ready to die because that pathogen has come in and taken care of them for us. That's just some more identification things that we've kind of already gone over here. Does anybody have Bermuda grass? Anybody wants to raise their hand? If they do, I'll be looking. I won't hit this too hard. I don't see anybody raising their hand yet, but this is kind of a relatively new pest to Missouri. I think maybe about 2 years ago, we kind of started seeing it more in Southwest Missouri, but basically what we're going to see here, I think maybe my next picture will show it a little bit better. If you have Bermuda grass and you start to notice the tips just look like they're drying up and dying, go ahead and cut open the stem, and you will probably find a maggot in there eating. That's not the greatest picture, but right there where that yellow arrow is, there's that cream colored larvae right there, and they just basically hollow out the stem, which causes the tips to die. And there's some better pictures of kind of what the damage is there as far as looking at it. They do like to find stem varieties. They're a little more susceptible. Late season with Bermuda grass is when they tend to peak. If you're starting to see a lot of damage, you really just need to go ahead and do an early harvest, and then maybe try with your second cutting or a following cutting to kill them with an insecticide. And then again, typically if we have a really nice, healthy looking stand of grass, no matter what it is, that's kind of what insects are typically drawn to, because that's a great safe place for them to hide or lay eggs. So those are the fields. Those fields that are looking the best are definitely the fields I would check first. Does anybody have any questions? I think that's all I have, Patrick.
Thanks, Jill. I don't see any questions. If anybody has any questions, please let us know.
And of course, if you ever have any trouble identifying a weed or any kind of pest in your field or your pasture, please call the extension office. There's an agronomist that covers your county, and they can come out and do a site visit and help you correctly identify that pest so that you can take the right control measures for it.
Not seeing any questions. I think I want to thank Jill and Wesley tonight for being on and talking. Also, just want to remind you about the evaluations. Please fill those out. And in the case of the satisfaction survey, send that back to me electronically. The other one will come back automatically once you submit it. And I also, Wesley sent me his presentation, so I went ahead and sent that out to you guys. We did record tonight, so you should be hopefully getting a video of tonight's talk tomorrow or probably the next day at the latest. But again, just want to thank you all for being on tonight. And if you ever have any questions or anything, just let us know. And so again, thank you, and we'll hopefully talk to you later.